Ladies, gentlemen, all the Pakistanis and friends of Pakistan here, Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon. On behalf of the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, PIDE, and Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, I welcome you all to the seminar on the development journey, Pakistan at 75. Like any long journey, it has its ups and downs. But if we have the clarity on the destination and prepare well for the journey, we believe we can get where we want to. To talk about this 75 years journey from where we started to where we are and where we want to be, we have speakers who have a keen eye on these developments. Today's seminar is divided into 3 sections. The first one is on what we have achieved in these 75 years, that is from 1947 to 2022. It is a privilege to have 3 great speakers for this segment, that is Dr. Hafiz Pasha, who would be joining us online, Dr. Ishrat Hussain, and Dr. Shamshad Akhtar. In the second part, we have 2 speakers who would talk about Pakistan in the next 25 years, and we are thankful to Dr. Gohar Ejaz, who was coming to Islamabad but his flight didn't take off because of the weather, so he would be joining online as well, and Mr. Zuhair Khalik to join us for this session. The third and the last session, which is on the vision for a prosperous Pakistan, our gratitude to Mr. Sartaj Aziz, who would be joining online, and Professor S.N. Iqbal to share their vision with us. I wish we had more time for all the speakers can have a whole seminar to themselves, but in the spirit of sharing on Pakistan's 75th birthday, I request all the speakers to restrict to the allocated time. Before we begin with the first session, I request Dr. Nadeemul Haq, Vice Chancellor PIDE and former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, to give context to the whole debate. Dr. Nadeemul Haq would talk about economic growth. It's never too late. Dr. Haq.
Thank you, Naya. My job is mainly to welcome all of you and welcome the panel. I think we've assembled probably one of the best panels in Pakistan, and for that I'm very grateful to all the members who took up our invitation at such short notice. Ishrat Saab especially came from Pakistan, Karachi I should say, and Gohar Ejaz was trying to catch his plane, and unfortunately the weather took over. Hafiz Pasha was ready to come, but then his health turned for the, took a turn. So Hafiz has agreed to be with us online. Shamshad is looking after her parents, so she is also going to join us online. So thank you, everyone. And I'd like to say to everyone, Pakistan Zindabad. Let me begin by saying, of course, all of us share the joy of being members of a free country, of what we hope would be a great club in the Committee of Nations. We have taken great pride in that, and we shall continue to take great pride in that. We thank the Planning Commission also for making Pakistan happen. Planning Commission has a great role in making Pakistan happen, and I'll talk about that as we go along. But to begin with, It is a joy, as I said, to have a nation, and it is a joy also to be free, and that's what we've been trying to celebrate and what we are celebrating today. Pakistan got a truncated state. What do I mean by that? That our supply lines were cut off as we were partitioned from the rest of India, and we had severe infrastructural shortages because the colonial rule left us dilapidated. So as Pakistan came into existence, there was a huge shortage of infrastructure to begin with, and that's where the Planning Commission comes in, the host of this seminar. Planning Commission took the struggle and created a substantial infrastructure. And the development achievements are huge. If you think about it, the road infrastructure that we've developed, we're all very proud of it because you can now whiz around Pakistan much better than you can whiz around the US. In fact, the US highways look much worse than ours. I don't know about the Germans, but the US look much worse than ours. Even the British highways don't look as good. So our development achievements have been substantial. We had a rural population. Now we have giant cities, 15 cities above 1 million, about 500 cities above 100,000. So we've got a very, very urbanized giant population. Our population, unfortunately, has grown at a fast rate, as Duranaya, one of the best demographers, will tell you. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to control that. But nevertheless, we made great strides in controlling poverty. 70% were poor when we started off. Literacy rates were very low. Now, our poverty rates are measured at somewhere around 8%. Now, we can quibble about how to measure it and get better rates, but nevertheless, our poverty rate has declined dramatically. If you think about it, we have built energy. When I was growing up and a long time ago, majority of the people in our neighborhood had no electricity. Today, it's hard to find houses without electricity. Maybe there are about 10-15% in the far out areas that don't have electricity. Schools, we have schools everywhere now. We have 236 universities. So all this has been done. Thank you, Planning Commission. Our middle class also has grown. Duray and I again did some work on this. We've got 60% of our people in the middle class. The consumer economy has grown, which is why you see McDonald's and all these consumer goods companies rushing to Pakistan, and that's very important. Majority of our population from no electricity now has TVs. Most of them have cell phones, 80 to 90% have mobile phones. So we've achieved a lot, and let's not forget that. Let's congratulate ourselves. But as in human history, there is no harvest celebration, no festival without worrying about the future and worrying about whether the rain will come and how do we store our harvest. So at 75, we must also note that there is a lot of work to be done. We've had 23 fund programs. Our debt stock is huge, and we are going through another major balance of payments crisis. So we must keep that in mind. We have a chronic fiscal problem. Our export, as well as our economic growth, as well as our productivity, are stagnating. Our growth goes up to 5% and kind of comes down. So we also have to think about, we've grown well, we've achieved a lot, but the counterfactual disturbs our population. Because in contrast, China, India, Bangladesh are outstripping us now. So we have to begin to look at our own performance and start worrying about where we go. Technical change, globalization has all helped us, but how do we participate in that? We must think about that too. Well, the Planning Commission started making the policy thanks to the Harvard Advisory Group and Mahbub al-Haq's famous book, The Structure for Economic Development. The Huck-Hag model came into force, which was basically do projects, borrow money, and hope for growth. And that's what we did. Through that, we built a huge infrastructure. But did we ever outgrow that model? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. That model made us dependent on external TA and debt, and I think we need to really think about it. How far should we continue with that model? The new model that have come up, thanks to Lucas and Romer, etc., is the endogenous growth model, which talks about internal technical change and reform. Following Bill Easterly, Arthur, and many others, we should also think about how our plans or our models come from the bottom up or top down, and we should think about that too. And that's fast becoming a problem for us too. This morning we had a webinar, which I should mention here, which is very important. Jacob Soul talked about economic history of Europe, and he said something very significant, which I want to bring to the audience here. He talked about the Industrial Revolution in Europe and Colbert in France. Colbert was the Prime Minister of Louis XIV in 1660. I hope I've got the number right. It's 14 or 18. I never can figure it out because they had too many Louis. But nevertheless, he talked about how France was taken by Colbert to catch up with England through three things that he mentioned, which are very important for us to learn, because he put this in the context of development literature. He said that Colbert adopted a very eclectic policy and a very intelligent policy, which put the focus on developing research, not just any research, but strong research in the country, and talked about developing free trade as well as clever protection. And this is something that we also have to think about. So with this background, I would like to say that to our excellent panel, I'd like to put 4 questions, and I hope people would reflect on them. Apart from, of course, they've got many other important questions that they would like to think about. The first is, recount our significant achievements. Tell us all that we've done. I've given you a short sketch. These guys will tell you much more because they're much better versed at it than I am. Tell us about the key turning points on Project Pakistan, key contributions to Project Pakistan. 75 successful years. But now, at the harvest, at our 75th Harvest Festival, they should also think about, at our stage of development, what are the changes in economic policy that we should think about? How should we celebrate our success? But along with celebrating our success, tell us about the approaching headwinds and how we should tackle them. In this context, I would argue, please tell us, should we continue with the Huck-Hag model, Mehboob Huq, Harvard Advisory Group model, which is projects and brick and mortar and getting more debt? Or should it be changed? And if it should be changed, to what? So with this, let me just say, welcome everybody, and let's proceed to learn from our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Huq, for setting the stage. With this, we move to the first thematic session, which is on what have we achieved from 1947 to 2022. And to begin the conversation, I request Dr. Hafeez Pasha, former Minister for Finance and Commerce and former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission, to talk about economic policies and development. Dr. Pasha.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Well, let me first felicitate our 75th anniversary. And for those of us who were born not much after partition, this is indeed a very, very important moment in our history. And the felicitations are very much in order, and Dr. Nadeemul Huq has done a very good job of highlighting some of our achievements. I and my students have been working on the data for the last 75 years, and I'd like to highlight a few of the findings. The first is that Pakistan's per capita income, which had been constrained severely by the impediments imposed by India, since 1947, our real income has gone up 4.5 times, mashallah, mashallah. The interesting thing is that if you look at the long-term growth rate of the 3 countries which constituted the Indian subcontinent and have since become independent countries, you find a fascinating, if you like, overall conclusion in terms of the long-term growth rate. All 3 countries have had a long-term growth rate just under 5%. Over the long term, they are almost exactly mathematically the same. India performed rather poorly in the first 3 decades. And in fact, we had developed an expression called the Hindu growth rate. And has, of course, since then done exceptionally well. Bangladesh, which has also celebrated its 50th anniversary, performed rather poorly in its first 2 decades and has done extremely well in the last 3 decades. Pakistan's performance is just the other way around. We performed very well up to the end of the 80s, and thereafter our growth rate has tended to falter. But in the long run, the average growth rate of these 3 countries is almost identical. And this goes contrary because we are all focused on recent performance, where certainly we are behind. The most fascinating finding, which took us weeks to arrive at, is the economic status of the Muslims of India. There are 213 million Indian Muslims today in the various states of India. There, particularly the concentration of Indian Muslims is in states like the Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Orissa, West Bengal, occupied Kashmir, and so on. Now, the Indians have state-wise GDP estimates almost since independence. We still don't have our provincial GDPs officially. Research has been done. But the point is that India has annual estimates of real per capita income in each of the 33 states of India. And all these 6 or 7 states with significant Muslim population are among the less developed states of India. That is a very strong fact. And the amazing report of Justice Sachar Commission's report on the economic and social status of the Muslims of India, a truly brave report, shows that even within these relatively less developed states of India with Muslim populations, the Muslims even within those states are below the average. So we've spent time, my students and I, to actually quantify what is the likely average per capita income of an Indian Muslim today. We of course know that the per capita income of India is significantly higher, but the amazing finding, ladies and gentlemen, is that Indian Muslims have a real per capita income 24% less. Let me repeat, 24% less than the Muslims of Pakistan. So I think that is a vindication of our efforts, and all compliments to our leaders, to our institutions, particularly the Planning Commission and others. And finally, one of the startling statistics is the incidence of poverty. Dr. Nadeem has already referred to it. The World Bank estimates of poverty at $3.20 PPP per day are really very revealing. Pakistan, the incidence, according to the last estimate, is 35%. Bangladesh, 52%. And India, despite higher per capita income, 62%. These are the World Bank estimates, not ours. Clearly, Pakistan has experienced much more inclusive growth than particularly India, which has had the problems of the caste system and discrimination against minorities. And my fear is that the condition of the Indian Muslims will get even worse. We wrote an article for the Dawn for the 75th century and the 75th anniversary, and they titled it very appropriately as Silver Lining in the Cloud. And indeed, this is a silver lining in the cloud. Let me just move very quickly to the future. A very appropriate message from the father of the nation has been quoted in the release on this event, in which he says, and I quote him, "Let us mobilize our resources in a systematic and organized way. This is the direction of the father of the nation, which has been quoted by the PIDE in its reference to this event. And let me say that this is where we really, in a way, are beginning to falter. The national tax to GDP ratio of Pakistan in 2021-22 is down to barely 10.3% of the GDP. And it is down from a peak which was close to 11.5% of the GDP in 2017-18. So in the last 4 years, we have seen the tax to GDP ratio slip badly. The biggest problem is the extraordinarily low collection of only 0.9% of the GDP by provincial governments, despite having the two large bases, agriculture and services, agricultural income tax and the provincial sales tax on services. Only 0.9% of the GDP. The share of direct taxes has declined to 23%. Our estimates of research, one of my students has just completed her PhD. The tax gap we estimate in Pakistan, our tax to GDP ratio with the new GDP should be close to 14% of the GDP. This is based on serious econometric analysis, and currently it stands at 10.3. So the tax gap is 3.5% of the GDP, almost 2,500 billion rupees. There is a need for fundamental tax reforms. The provincial governments have to get into the Resource Mobilization Act. They have been laggards thanks to a very soft National Finance Commission, which has gone disproportionately in their favor. We at the university, at the Beacon House Center for Policy Research, have developed over the last 6 months a comprehensive agenda of tax reforms. At any stage of the Planning Commission or any other institution so desires, we would be happy to discuss the features and the strategy of these tax reforms directly with the appropriate presence from the government. And let me conclude by saying that, as said by the Honorable Father of the Nation, resource mobilization should be at the core of our development strategy. And my own view is Pakistan has to move away from physical project emphasis towards policy and structural reform. And I quite agree with Dr. Nadeemul Haq that there is a need for a change of the planning ideology. I thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for your hearing. And let me conclude by once again congratulating ourselves on the 75th anniversary of our beloved, honorable country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pasha, for showing us both sides of the picture. Now I move to Dr. Ishrat Hussain, former Governor, State Bank of Pakistan, and advisor to government on governance reforms, to talk about governance, a panacea. Dr. Hussain.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, let me thank the Planning Commission and PIDE for inviting me to share my thoughts in this particular forum. You have already seen my article, which appeared in the news, so I'm not going to repeat. And a lot of what Nadeem and Dr. Pasha have said is already in this article, so I wouldn't go again and repeat those facts and figures about the achievements, as Nadeem wanted what the recent achievements were. But I wanted to contrast the first 40 years of Pakistan's history, economic history, when Pakistan was one of the fastest growing developing countries with an average growth of 40 years of 6%, as compared to the next 35 years from 1990 to 2022, when it has gone down to less than 4%. While our competitors like India have gone from 3.5% growth rate 40 years to 7%. And Bangladesh, which was almost considered a basket case by Henry Kissinger at the time of 1971, is now growing at 6 to 7% consistently. So what went wrong between these two periods? And I took the opportunity of the accessing the Library of Congress to figure out what the literature about Pakistan depicts. And there were 4 or 5 hypotheses. One was the garrison state hypothesis, that this has been dominated by the military, and because the military has been one of the major beneficiaries of the economic development, therefore the country didn't do so well from 1990 onwards, when its interventions were not direct but indirect. Now I look at the data and I found that the peak of the defense expenditure was in 1980, which was 6%, and it was from 1950 onwards, and particularly after 65 war, the defense expenditure had gone up. And now, over 1990 to 2022, it is now below 3%. So that cannot explain the crowding out effect, and the share of the defense expenditure in the total current expenditure of Pakistan is now 17% compared to almost 50% previously. The second hypothesis was that all the years of growth were dependent on aid flows, so 60s, 80s, 2000 to 2007. And I compared the 1960s flows, because there was data available, with 1970s, and I found that the annual flows in the 1970s were much higher than the 1960s. Although the composition had changed, it was not the Western countries, but it was the OPEC countries and the Islamic countries which came to help Pakistan particularly after the oil shock. Then I compared 1980s, when people say that because of the Afghanistan war, we took a lot of money from the US, and compared with 1990s. In 1990s, despite the fact that the US was not the major funder of Pakistan, Japan had overtaken and was the largest single bilateral, and the World Bank and other institutions continued, and the balance of payment was financed by the resident and non-resident deposits of $11 billion. And that flows, if you take them, normalize that also is lower than 1980s. And 2000, 2007, against the Afghan war, you have flows coming back to Pakistan, but the Kerry-Lugar bill, which came from 2009 to 2014, had much higher appropriation and disbursements compared to what happened in 1980. So this hypothesis was also empirically not validated. The third one was the fact that, international economic environment was not very conducive in the 35 years. The facts are that the developing countries have actually had the fastest growth during the 1990 to 2020, and the share of the developing countries in the global trade was much higher, growth rate was much higher than that of the advanced countries. And it was the same time India was able to increase its share from 0.5% of the world exports to 1.5%, and Bangladesh from 0.1% to 0.4%, and ours declined from 0.2% to 0.1%. So the international environment also does not explain this particular phenomenon. So what does it explain? A new insight has been provided by a very rich literature on institutional economics, which looks at how the institutions of governance actually deliver the basic goods and services, how they help in the rise of productivity, how they affect the distribution of income so that you can have an inclusive growth rate. And the contrast between the institutions which made Pakistan so strong despite 4 shocks, settlement of 8 million refugees in a country which didn't have a single penny in the coffers because Reserve Bank of India did not release Pakistan's share at the time of partition. And if you look at the balance sheet of the State Bank of Pakistan today, we still consider that as receivables, which we haven't received so far. And our civil servants were paid by Habibs and Adamjis. They didn't have the money. Second shock, 1965 war. Third shock, the separation of East Pakistan, 1974. Fourth shock, the nationalization of industries, universities, colleges, and insurance and banking. Fifth shock, the Afghan war. Despite these 5 shocks, Pakistan had very strong institutions. And I will give you just 4, and I would say the Planning Commission was one of the strongest institutions at that time. And I leave it to you to judge the performance of the first 40 years of Planning Commission, starting from Mr. Zahid Hussain, who was the first deputy chairman who wrote the first 5-year plan, till today. I won't comment on that, but I leave it to your judgment as to what has happened to the quality and the strength of the Planning Commission. Second was the PIDC. Pakistan didn't have any big industrial houses. It didn't have any industry worth its name except one cement factory and few carriage factories and cotton ginning factories. By 1969, and this is not my saying, but the Development Policy Review of the World Bank said in 1969, Pakistan's manufactured exports were higher than those of Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. That was the PIDC, which established the industries, but said that the government is not in the business of running businesses. The private sector was short of capital, so PICIC and IDBP financed these companies, these enterprises, and they were then transferred to the private sector, which managed them quite well and made them competitive for exports. Third, Agriculture Development Corporation. We were unable to meet the food needs of 30 million Pakistanis at 1950. 3 million tons of wheat was produced. Then we had the Mexipac seed for wheat, the IRI for rice, the fertilizers. They were all managed and distributed by Agriculture Development Corporation. I was an assistant commissioner in a subdivision, and we got the target that so much land has to be shifted from the traditional varieties to the new varieties. How much fertilizer will be allocated to your subdivision? Up to the tehsil level they were targeting, and that was the work of the Agriculture Development Corporation. The third was WAPDA. Pakistan lost Ravi and Beas, and we were short of water. They undertook the Indus Basin Works program, and all the link canals, barrages, and the 2 dams were all constructed by WAPDA. The entire engineering staff of WAPDA, who supervised the Indus Basin Works, headed by Mr. Salar Kirmani, were en bloc recruited by the World Bank and sent all over the world, saying that if you want to learn irrigation, these are the people who would teach you irrigation. Since 1972, we never had one single reservoir. And finally, I'll give you the example of PIA. PIA was the only airline which was doing transatlantic and had, flights to all over the world. And this was the airline which established the Singapore Airlines, the Jordanian Royal Airlines, and later on the Emirates Airlines. Last time, I was asked to restructure the PIA, and the cumulative liabilities of PIA today are 450 billion rupees. So you can contrast where is PIDC. They have an ugly looking building which they can't even whitewash that, and it looks so hideous. ADC is no longer existent. WAPDA has just woken up and started some reservoirs, and the PIA is where it is. And this Planning Commission, which was actually the supplier of most of the people to the World Bank and IMF, stands where it is today. So I'll close my remarks because I'm now conscious that I have exceeded my time. But I leave this thought to you that institutions of governance do matter. And if you go behind any crisis, whether it is disaster management, whether it is the delivery of education, whether it is the health service, or the irrigation canal thefts and shortages and inefficiencies in any government department, these can all be attributed to the decay of the institutions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ishrat Hussain, and the news article he mentioned is there in front of your chairs and tables. Do take it with you. Now we turn to Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, former Governor, State Bank of Pakistan, and caretaker Finance Minister, who would be joining us online. She would be talking about banking and finance for development. Over to you, Dr. Akhtar.
Thank you very much. Deeply honored to have been invited and connected via Zoom. I have to thank the Minister as well as Nadeemul Haq for inviting me. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It's been very impressive what I have heard. My job is much more smaller. I have to talk about financial sector. Financial sector's transformation and turnaround is one of the leading success stories of Pakistan. Evidence has confirmed that this is an outcome of the privatization of banks, our financial sector liberalization, which has moved in jewels, and restructuring and divestment and demutualization of stock exchange, and its eventual unbundling. Strong oversight of central bank stands out for strengthening the banking sector policies, regulatory and supervisory framework. Let me take a minute to talk about the history of the financial sector, which will be very brief. After establishment of the State Bank of Pakistan in 1948, country was quick to lay foundation of banking system, which was supposedly to be much more open. But the bank nationalization in 1990 transferred almost 92% of the banking assets to public sector. Financial liberalization took off in 1991. Banks were privatized and entry requirements were eased, including for foreign banks, whose number at that point rose to 27. Later on rose to 27. However, there has been an exit of some foreign banks. I'll get back to the foreign banks point. In terms of the banking sector, from requiring recapitalization, given the large legacy loans, banks are now profitable ventures, offering high return to its owners and contributing to financial intermediation and tax revenues, a lesson that can be learned for other state-owned sector. Now banks' capital adequacy ratio is 16.7%, well above the minimum regulatory requirement of 11.5%. Backed by strong capital buffers, the banking sector resilience grew and withstood frequent bouts of macroeconomic vulnerabilities and even the 2020 pandemic. I'm proud to say that Pakistan in this area has done much better than India, whose financial system has run into difficulty because they have a higher proportion of state-owned banks. Banking sector attracted close to $4 billion of FDI during 2006 to 2008. At their height, foreign bank constituted about half of the bank assets. They helped in boosting innovation and technological change, and their non-performing loans were almost half of the local private banks and much lower relative to public sector, which was 14%. Let me fast forward. Bank assets now in calendar year 21 stand at 30 trillion, with growth in investments leading the expansion. Is this high enough? Absolutely not. We have potential to do more in the banking sector in terms of the growth in assets. Growth in banking deposits mobilized in calendar year 21 is 3 trillion rupees, which is now a reflection of higher remittances, flows in the RDA, the Roshan digital account of a category, increased use of digital channels, which indicates the transformation underlying the changes happening, and rise in returns due to monetary tightening. And of course, advances have grown to the services, to different sectors, to service different sectors. Intermediation process, however, has been stifled because banks have been lazy. We have had low advance deposit ratio, which has been falling also. Banks have directed funds that they have mobilized and also borrowed to finance government securities, something which we call financial or fiscal repression that's been happening. Let me take a few minutes to talk about non-bank sector, but focus more on capital markets in interest of time. Karachi Stock Exchange was incorporated in 1948 at the same time as the central bank. And later in 1970, we had the wisdom to open up Lahore and Islamabad stock exchanges as if one was not enough. So fragmentation of exchanges coupled with low market capitalization resulted in splitting price discovery process, and these exchanges were broker dominated. I just see Sattaj Aziz Saab joining us, and I had the privilege of negotiating the first capital market operation when he was the finance minister, and it was a very difficult process at that time. By mid-1990, sweeping capital market reforms led to consolidation of 3 exchanges, and PSX was established. It has been automated, demutualized, corporatized, and listed, something which we could not have thought in early 70s or even later. Today, we have modern depository, custodial services, and clearing and settlement subsidiaries. They are really world-class outfits. After listing, world's largest Chinese stock exchange took 40% stake in PSX, and Habib Bank also took a small stake of 5%. The rest is held by public and track holders. This was all unthinkable in the beginning of our development phase. Today, of course, we have 550 odd listed companies, something which we are not very proud of. We really need to have private sector come forward and list all their issues, both equity and debt. We have a state-of-art PMEX, the Commodities Exchange, which is web-based, technology-driven commodity futures exchange. It is breaking new grounds for agriculture product and other trading. At PXX, issuers have raised funding, which over the decade, despite the small number of the companies, we have been able to mobilize about ₹1 trillion, bulk of which 550 billion were mobilized over the last 6 years. Half being through debt issuance, although our debt market is very small for our requirements, while equity issues have been very small, 50 billion or so, and rights issue about 197 billion. Pakistan attracted foreign portfolio investments and was in the league of MSCI. However, because of a range of issues, we were back into the frontier, but we will get back to MSCI as I see. The market of Pakistan is attractive, like the banking system, but here we have low price earning ratios, high returns, and lucrative business opportunities, and high industry profitability. Besides now, PSX standards of disclosure and corporate governance excel today. PSX governance has been strengthened, and again, it was not thought earlier, but its board includes shareholders and independent directors, only 2 track holders, a sea change. PSX is now operationalizing a very new 3 years strategy and will be seeking to attract new brokers. Their number is now 200, but we need an expansion and more than doubling the investors to over 500,000, with eventual further expansion through outreach and technology. PSX has potential to tap more Sharia-compliant financing. It's already half of our listed companies are Sharia-compliant, and we have Sharia-compliant asset classes indices also. PSX offers a competitive, transparent financing avenue to facilitate privatization of state-owned enterprises and for raising private equity and debt also. Government has been able to raise funds for OGDC, PTCL, and other government-owned entities. And if PI were to survive, I'm sure we could raise money for them. So that results in generation of billions of dollars. And also a recent sukuk helped in a competitive deal, which actually resulted in substantial savings. We are working now to operationalize the state-of-the-art national trading surveillance system, which will allow the exchange to add futures and derivative products, besides over 6 of REITs and exchange-traded funds. In addition, GEM Market for the small-scale companies has already offered a platform for SMEs to raise their equity and fund requirements. We are again at the frontier stage. The World Federation of Stock Exchanges has approved PSX just last month for joining the League of the Sustainable Stock Exchange, and we plan to introduce ESG, environment, social governance reporting guidelines, and developing its taxonomy for market cap companies. Now, this is where we will be able to influence the social dimension and also the governance dimension. Let me say, like every other sector, besides the good news, we have lots to worry about. Within South Asia region, Pakistan's banking system stands out for being well capitalized. Profitability is good, performance has been strong, but viewed in the backdrop of 75 years and looking at our peers and the neighbors, notable gaps remain in our financial markets, and segments of financial markets are small. Private sector credit GDP ratio is half of the average of the emerging market economies, and our corporate segment accounts for close to 70% of the loan book. Undoubtedly, 79% of a population is unbanked, with women inclusion barely at 13%. Infrastructure financing gap is in the range of 6 to 8% of GDP, and SMEs account for only 6.3% of outstanding private credit. When I left the central bank, this ratio was 17%. So we have been regressing. And what is sorry state of affairs is that our credit only reaches 173,000 SMEs. Agriculture credit accounts for just 5.6% of private sector financing. Cost of delivery is very high. Informal sector charges you exorbitant rates. Equity and debt markets ready to be used are underexploited. While innovation and digitization is running fast in this country, we have yet to mainstream this and deploy it to address the unfinished agenda. We have to take a comprehensive and integrated financial market view, and we need financial markets that is interdependent. It needs to lay a foundation for an equitable, efficient, and sustainable growth. We have developed microfinance banks and microfinance institutions. We have new emerging SMEs and an Apex microfinance bank. And also we have developed now 2 private credit enhancement companies, which are going to be state-of-art, one for SMEs and one for infrastructure sector, which has been done through funding provided by a private entity called Karandas. To improve financial intermediation, advanced deposit ratios have to be higher than what they are. They go down to 40%, they come up to 43, 45, but this is unacceptable. And this is despite the refinancing and subsidies, which is only available through the banks, not through the capital markets, thank God. So capital markets are being undermined by the banks, and capital markets are the key providers of the long-term risk capital, where price discovery is market driven. So there are contradictions within segments of the market. In insurance industry, which is now only 5% of our total financial assets, is the most neglected sector from the government and the regulatory point of view. The regulation is split between the Ministry of Commerce and SECP. I cannot imagine why we would split the policy and regulation. And studies after studies have been done, and I contributed one very big paper on it, and it has been gathering dust, which is a lot of other papers have done the same and met the same fate. The financial system will eventually have to be transformed to service people, and more are poor people, businesses, infrastructure, and the economy. I've talked about the exclusion, but I have to say that branchless banking was introduced in 2006 to 2008. We have now helped central bank set up the micropayment gateway system through the Karandas, which has helped in modernizing the payment system and laid the foundation for the RAS program, which is a great achievement. And slowly our mobile and internet banking is growing. And there are lots of technology providers that are out there providing innovative.
Sorry, Dr. Shamshad, for interrupting you. Can you please wind up?
Yes, I'm just concluding, actually.
I'm so sorry.
I'm just concluding. And I wanted to just say that there is also digital banking system that is underway. So there is a lot that I have covered in terms of the achievements, as well as in terms of the agenda as we were being advised. I think there are 5 growth areas in conclusion that I'd like to highlight. One is the digital finance, which is giving access to finance to the excluded groups of people as well as underserved sectors. Risk capital, which is spurring the growth and development of innovation and startup ecosystem, very much needed. Microfinance, of course, reaching out more to the pyramid, to the bottom of the pyramid. Development finance has not been tapped effectively. And of course, capital markets, which have yet to do much more to support the origination of flows of long-term finance. So thank you. With this, I think our work is cut out, like in every other sector. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar, for a great summary on how the financial sector has evolved and is evolving in Pakistan. With this, we come to the end of the first segment, which was on the last 75 years, and now we would shift to the next 25 years when Pakistan would be 100. Dr. Gohar Ejaz, who was to be here, is not with us here. He'll be joining us online. He's Chief Executive Ejaz Group of Companies, and he'll be sharing his views on business and investment environment. Dr. Ejaz.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor today to be addressing this webinar. I would like to congratulate Dr. Nadeem Haq for putting such an august house together, for reviewing what we have done in 75 years and what we plan to do in next 25 years. Representing textiles, I'll focus my discussion on textiles. There's a very interesting situation which I would like to bring to the house, because we continue to talk about our economy, but we don't look at the reality of what is there in our economy. I would like to just bring you forward a chart. And my chart is basically driving us towards the vision of how Pakistan can achieve an exports from $20 billion to $40 billion in next 5 years. When I say that, we have achieved this target first time in 2001, when we created Vision 2005. In 5 years, we doubled the exports from $5 billion to $10 billion. Second time we did this now in 10 years, where we increased our exports from $10 billion to $20 billion in textiles, approximately 19.3 exactly. But the situation, if you look at my chart here, is very clear. There are islands of excellence. We have Textile, who has exported $611 million this year, is number 1. But when I look at the top 10, and I go down to number 10, it's Masood Textile at $255 million. And when I average all 10, the average is $360 million. So there is one island of excellence on it, which is $600 million, but the top 10 companies of the country exporting are only $360 million. And worst of all, there is only one company, United Energy, who is exporting, which is other than textiles in top 10. When I go down to top 20, the exports drop down to $172 million at number 20. And I go down further to number 40, the exports go down to $100 million. And when I go down to number 100, it goes down to $53 million. So the cake which we have, this cake, when I calculated for top 100 exporters of the country, was $13.5 billion. Out of those $13.5 billion, the top 40 contributed $6.5 billion, and the balance 60 contributed $6.5 billion. So the average exports from our country is $130 million per business house. When I look at these numbers, I continue to wonder, what is the problem? Is our country just capable enough to create entrepreneurs of $130 million? The answer is no. We can create one with $600 million who started 30 years ago with stitching plant. I remember in Kot Lakhpat, I visited his factory in 1992. just with 200 stitching machines, and has touched $611 million, and the largest manufacturer and supplier for Adidas and Nike, both of them together from his 2 plants here. Same goes for lots and lots. But what worries me, there are 6 rice exporters here. There are 4 metal exporters here. There are 2 petrochemical exporters here, 2 petroleum products here. So there is nothing. And when we say that textile is the sunset industry of Pakistan, I totally disagree. And that is what I'm trying to present here. When I look down and I see last year, number 1 exporter of the country increased. He was the same person, Textile. He was $429 million, has come to 612. He's up 50%. Like I said, he broke that barrier and went up by 50% last year. But otherwise, if I look at all averages, everybody has increased their export quantitatively and value-wise on an average 30%. This is where we stand with the whole chart. When I look at the export performance, which I said in 2012, I was $12.3 billion. Today at 19.3, I am targeting to be $25 billion next year. We continue to hear that Pakistan does not export value added. You'll be surprised to see here today. It's $19.3 billion and more than 80% is all value added. The number 1 export is knitwear garments. Number 2 export is woven garments. Number 3 export is home textile. Number 4 is towel. There is then, when I say this, that 80% is value added, I still have $2.4 billion of dyed fabric with me. This $2.4 billion of dyed fabric, I put in a vision how I can increase this to $10 billion. I still have $1.2 billion of yarn surplus. I can add value, another $10 billion there. So I have this $20 billion of raw material with me for finished products in Pakistan. And I need a very low investment now because $5 billion, which I've invested in last 2 years, has created my infrastructure for yarn fabric, dyed fabric, all of it, which was all capital intensive. Now I'm moving down and I'm comparing for the first time. I'm saying that in last 10 years, from 2010 to 18, rather 8 years, my exports could not compete with Bangladesh. We were up 39% and they were up 145%. But in these last 4 years, I've gone up 43% compared to their 32%. The only reason is one, I was given regional competitive energy tariff for the first time. I thank PIDE for it, Dr. Nadeemul Haq personally. They did the whole market survey and 35% is the cost of production for energy. And if I am giving 2 times the energy cost, which is there in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India, which is maximum 9 cents, I cannot compete with any of them. And when I was given this 9 cent, I proved that I'm not less than Bangladesh. I wish the policymakers would have listened to me from 2013 to 18 also, and we would not have been suffering this current account deficit of $15 billion today. The average value, I continue to hear people saying without looking at the facts, in 2012, at the same cotton price, which it is today, $1.20, the average price of export was $2.18 per kg from Pakistan, which is up 300%. In last 8 years, it's $6.48 today. Now my vision, I want that textile sectors should commit to set up 1,000 garment plants. I look at the average size, which is an optimal size for a stitching plant, which is 500 stitching machines. These 500 stitching machines, each one will have a worker of 700 workers directly. The average investment to set up one is $7 million for 500 machines, but we can set it up at a cost of $2.5 million and then grow to $7 billion. Start with 200 machines and go to 500 machines. With this $7 billion investment, I go up to $20 billion in export of garments. What do I need? My requirement is simple. My requirement is I can give you this $40 billion exports in 5 years. Investment is not large. This is stitching plants only. I will be putting up $2 billion of stitching plants every year. The major cost is infrastructure, because stitching machines are not expensive, but the construction is expensive. The working capital is required. That's what I said, that each plant requires $7 million. My point is that my working capital is stuck. I'll give you a chart. I have made a chart. The new policy was started, whereas they said that 0 rating should be withdrawn from the textile value chain. When you withdraw the 0 rating, this results in my amount being paid, and then across the value chain from cotton to yarn to fabric to dyed fabric, which cannot be consumed directly by anybody. Not be consumed, I repeat, directly, because nobody eats cotton, nobody wears yarn, nobody wears gray fabric. It's all about after dyed fabric. And my vertical setups, if I have a complete vertical setup, I don't need to pay from yarn to fabric to dyed fabric. But here, I'm made to pay, and you'll be surprised to see that in 2021, last year, at item number 33 is textiles. This is the exact sales tax collection report of the government of Pakistan, FBR. At number 3, they say that a total amount of 160 billion plus was collected, 148 was refunded, 18.4 was the net collection. This year, they say they have collected 254 billion, refunded 199 billion, and the total amount they've collected is 49.9 billion. So I take this year's 22 June number, 200 billion rupees collected and refunded for a collection of 49.9 billion, which is to be collected from the consumers. And my 200 billion rupees remains stuck with them because it's a 10-month cycle, because they refund on consumption and export. And my cycle is 7 to 8 months. Now, 200 billion rupees of my capital is stuck. I don't know how much value it is adding to FBR, but with this 200 billion rupees, which is my money stuck at all times with FBR, which is a wrong policy to collect from us rather than the consumers at the finishing stage. This is holding me hostage for further expansion right now. Next point, which is most important, is that we need to create, through the support of the government, technical education, vocational training institutes should have a department of stitching management. The TEFTAs are there. The universities should have the government management courses there. If this is the future for Pakistan for $20 billion, then the whole nation has to come together. If we cry for $16 billion current account deficit and we all get together to go in, the whole cabinet goes in for $3 billion of investment to Qatar, why can't we just sit together and put this house in order? I can guarantee you that we will give you $5 billion annually for next 4 consecutive years. Thank you very much.
And communication technology, we at PIDE now consider internet as a basic human right. As we believe in the coming days, the haves and have-nots would be based on the digital divide. I invite Dr. Zuhair Khalik, founder and general partner, Team Up Ventures, to talk about ICT for development.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, the Planning Commission, and the PIDE for inviting me here today. It's a privilege and an honor. I will try and focus on basically what I was just introduced as digitization. Before that, if I can just take a couple of minutes, I read a very, very interesting report from HSBC called The World at 2030. And what the report says is that over the next decade, approximately 70% of global growth will be from countries currently described as emerging. Compare that with about 50% over the previous decade. China will be the single largest contributor to the global growth over the next decade, and by 2030 will be the world's largest economy. And I don't see that as a surprise at all. India will be the 3rd largest economy, leapfrogging from 7th place today. And most interestingly for me, Bangladesh, India, Philippines, Vietnam, and Pakistan are forecast to be among the 5 fastest growing markets at that time. More interestingly, technology will dramatically offset demographic drag. And I think that's the key to what we discuss here today. We don't necessarily have to go through this slide. It's all about the Pakistan macros. I think most of you are very familiar. What is important to note is that our young population, the low unemployment, third fastest growing middle class globally, and the healthy macros until recently will make Pakistan one of the most promising economies for investors in the next decade. And as McKinsey report and a Statista report say that Pakistan is forecast to be the 20th largest economy in the world, 2030. What is very interesting here also is that the World Economic Forum indicates that any increase in the digitization of a country by 10% would lead to a 1.25% increase in GDP, something we discussed earlier in various speakers, and a 1% drop in the unemployment rate. Now that is very significant, and I think we should focus a little bit on that later on. Pakistan today is the third fastest growing middle class in the world. By 2025, it's forecast that 60 million will have joined the middle class. In 2015, that number was 62 million. By 2025, we're looking at 122 million. The 60 million, if you can just imagine for a moment, is equivalent to the entire population of Italy and the UK for that matter, and 1.5 times the population of Spain. So we're talking very, very large, very significant numbers here. Now, one of the fundamentals of a digital economy, and I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes here, we have most of these in place now, or almost most of them. We have digital identity. Nadra does a great job, and over the last 5 or 6 years, as we've combined the Nadra database with the mobile company databases, that has empowered the enablement of digital identity across Pakistan. We are gaining more and more foothold in digital commerce on a daily basis right now. And especially in the last 2 years with COVID, I have personally seen that literally go up like a hockey curve. Even your local stores, your Kiryana stores, are beginning to adopt digital ways of selling. A digital lifestyle, I think we already know. Most of us own a mobile phone, or maybe 2 even, and that's already where we are. Connectivity is the bedrock, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go into the next couple of slides. And the platforms where the internet is basically enabling people to get multifaceted services from the internet. Digital citizenship is something that we're still missing, which is migrating public channels onto a digital way, the government moving onto digital platforms, and I think that would be a very significant thing that we need to work on as we go forward. We're again of the amazing growth in the telecom infrastructure. The last time I checked, it was the end of June, 195 million mobile connections. 98% of households own a mobile phone. We have 88% teledensity, and we have at least 116 million people connected on 3 and 4G. That means they have access to the internet, and that number is growing by 500,000 new smartphones per month. So very significant ways to grow. We forecast that, this is reports from the GSMA and others, we forecast that the smartphones will hit 146, maybe 150 million by 2025. We're already seeing an expansion, a rapid expansion of our fiber optic infrastructure, which is key to obviously supplying mobile connectivity. Very importantly, we're getting Samsung and Oppo and so many others now actually manufacturers based in Pakistan producing low quality, lower cost handsets, which are going into the hands of digital natives, because again, remember 65 to 70% of our population below the age of 30. So they are very easily adapted to digital technology and mobile phones. We also have a very rapidly growing infrastructure, and Dr. Shamshad very kindly alluded to some of it. But 96% of our country, adults in the country have a Nadra issued CNIC. Now, that is crucial to what I said earlier, the digital identity part, where you can do KYC processes digitally. 70% of the people in Pakistan today are still unbanked, but 98% of households have access to a mobile phone. So there is clearly an amazing potential here for getting those people onto the banking systems very, very quickly. over the last couple of years, you've seen the growth of digital banking, the digital wallet, with obviously EasyPesa and JazzCash being here for almost 10 plus years. But we've also seen Connect HBL, Kareem Pay, UBL Digital, SafePay, and now a lot of digital banking licenses being issued. And I think all of that will contribute hugely towards the rapid growth, not only of the financial infrastructure, but I believe the economic progress of the country as well. Now, this is an interesting chart which I pulled off the PTA website, the Pakistan Telecom Authority, and I never really actually knew what a petabyte meant until I looked it up, and it's actually 1 petabyte is 1 million gigabytes. And if you look at that chart, till March this year, we were operating in the ecosystem 2.2 trillion gigabytes of data, and it's growing at over the 9 months previously, it's grown at 53%. So again, extremely impressive in the way it's moving. Now, the overall impact of the ICT sector on the economy in Pakistan today, and again, I'm depending on a report from the GSM Association, which says that in up to 2020, the ecosystem had reached $18 billion, which is 5.4% of GDP. By 2023, this economic contribution will reach to 24 billion, which is going to be 6.6% of GDP. So those are very, very interesting and very exciting figures to look at. A majority of this uplift will be driven by wider network coverage and the rapid adoption of 4G services. Pakistan, as you know, is ranked 4th in the world for freelance development and also consistently ranked among the top destinations for IT sourcing. Now, projected market for e-commerce over the next 3 years to 2025, we're looking at about $7.8 billion, and this is reported by the PTA. And the number of e-commerce users is expected to reach, 65 million in the same time period. The M-Banking network, the mobile banking network, today has expanded to over 500,000 M-Banking agents, almost 75 million mobile wallets at the end of 2021. Now, this again is growing rapidly, and the annual the transactions were 2.2 billion, which is worth about 8 trillion rupees at the moment. My personal belief is that our aim should be to harness a 3 to 5% enhancement in GDP per capita over the next 3 years through digitization. And I mentioned earlier, each 10% of the economy being digitized will give you about 0.25%. So we're looking at a 30 to 40% digitization process over the next 3 years or so. Now, this will not all happen automatically. This will happen because some things have to change. Today, Pakistan actually is the largest taxpayer in terms of the Pakistani mobile consumer. I beg your pardon, is the largest, he pays one of the largest taxes in the world. 31% of what is called the TCMO, the cost of mobile ownership, is taxed. Okay, so every time an average customer scratches a 100 rupee scratch card, 31 rupees of that goes straight to the government treasury. The global average is 19%. So clearly we are out of sync a little bit. Similarly, operators are taxed heavily, all kinds of taxes, corporate tax and alternative tax and personal income tax and worker welfare, capital value tax, withholding tax, and it goes on. And it is one of the most heavily taxed industries in Pakistan today. Now, policy directives are the key to fulfilling any of these digital objectives. And to me, we've been working on some of them. I had the privilege of being part of the Pakistan PM's task force on IT and telecom over the last 3 years or so. Right-of-way policy, which is directive, has only recently come out about 7 or 8 months ago, and it's just beginning to get absorbed. And that basically means that the ability to be able to negotiate at a fixed rate the option to lay an optic fiber cable from point A to point B, which is what basically energizes and supports the entire ecosystem. Similarly, rural fiberization by the US is sitting on close to $1 billion in contributions from the telco industry, but is very, very slow in deploying this and enabling the spread of telco and especially data telecom into the rural areas of Pakistan. Infrastructure sharing is happening, but again needs to happen on a much faster basis. And Nadra today charges a spread of telcos and telecom density. Similarly, I've mentioned the taxes and duties, the taxes on smartphones today, and spectrum is a big issue where they charge a significant amount of money from the telecom authority every couple of years to award additional spectrum, and I think there needs to be a revisit of that. The GSMA report 2020 says that Jazz and Zong have already tested non-commercial 5G networks, and they know that it's going to work, and obviously 5G will take us to Internet of Things and all the rest of it. But what again they advise that a spectrum pricing reset is advised in order for the operators to encourage them to invest in the country and make that happen. My favorite thing here, the Pakistan startup ecosystem. When I came back 6 years ago, I started something called the National Incubation Center. And people used to ask me, what is a startup and what is an entrepreneur? 6 years on, we, last year, Pakistan received $382 million of venture capital funding across about 70 deals. In 2022, despite the economic downturn worldwide, we've so far received about $340 million. 40 million of that is just coming in the last 6 weeks, and we estimate this to end at about $750 million at the end of this year. And that, I think, is going to spur on the whole digitization process that I've been talking about over the last few minutes. Now, it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to leapfrog an entire development stage from analog to digital, and in the process contribute hugely to that GDP growth that we're all looking for. Just some of the VC investments over the last 7 or 8 months. Some of them are very large ones. There's Bazaar, $70 million. There's the $36 million. I haven't got here $18 million just received by D-Bank about 4 weeks ago, which will catalyze the entire digital banking ecosystem as well, and so on and so forth. As of a week ago, in fact 5 days ago, startups, Cloudways is a startup which has just been acquired by a US giant called DigitalOcean for $350 million. So also some of the concerns that we've had about will this ever get to an exit stage is beginning to happen also, I'm very happy to say. So my vision of a long-term Pakistan is a digital Pakistan, and digital technology has to be at the hub of it, whether it's digital literacy, EdTech as we call it, telemedicine, MedTech, Agri-Tech, education, whether it's blockchain technology, financial inclusion I've already spoken a lot about, digital government, very, very key to all of this, and of course digitized property and artificial intelligence is already taking place. And basically what you're saying is that we will have broadband access to all in the country, and that will change in the next decade substantially the economics of this country and its rank amongst similar countries elsewhere in the world. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Mr. Khalik. And this brings us to the last session of the seminar, which is Vision for a Prosperous Pakistan. It is our honor to have Mr. Sartaj Aziz with us to share his views on what his vision of a thriving Pakistan is. Mr. Sartaj Aziz has been the Minister of Finance, Advisor on the Foreign Affairs, and the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. He would be joining us online. Over to you, Mr. Aziz.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear friends and colleagues, we have had some very, very interesting and concise presentations. And as I said, I have seldom heard so much condensed wisdom in only 1.5 hours. I like to supplement this presentation by referring to some lessons and some recommendations. And the lessons that I want to focus on are those which have serious long-term consequences, but which are remediable. There are some missed opportunities that cannot be remedied now, but these, in my view, can be remedied. The first one I like to identify is our inability to evolve an affordable energy policy based on domestic coal and renewable resources. As most of you are aware, after the Indus Basin work under which Mangla and Tarbela were completed, we were not able to undertake any water project because of the lack of consensus on the water apportionment. Fortunately, in March 91, an historic water accord was signed, and the way was opened for taking up more hydel projects. But within 3 years, the government then came up with an IPP, Independent Power Producers Policy, based on imported thermal oil and furnace oil, offering them 6.5% fixed rate plus the cost of oil. Now, at that time, it was probably 2 rupees plus 1 rupees, and later on, as the exchange rate deteriorated and oil price went up, at present prices, they are about 13, 14 rupees fixed charge and 6, 7 rupees. So, as we were selling electricity at less than 10 rupees, initially 9 rupees, the cost of this new electricity, which became 40% of our total at 18, 20 rupees, created the circular debt problem, which is now close to 2,300 billion rupees. So this, and of course, third coal, we hardly paid any attention until recently. So this has created a serious problem of unaffordable energy. Industry can't get cheap power, as you just heard, and also long hour of load shedding because of unaffordable power. So as Hafiz Pasha said, energy has become a black hole in which our economy is sinking. So this is the first major issue. The second I like to identify is our failure to adopt an effective population policy. We have not been able to do so, and therefore our population growth rate is the highest in the region. And this has affected all our social indicators. If we had the same population growth rate as Bangladesh, our literacy percentage is much higher, our health coverage will be much higher, our agriculture surpluses will be there for exports, and our housing shortage would not be so acute. Thirdly, a third area I like to mention is the persistent irreactive factors that affect productivity in our economy, in almost all sectors. Research is very inadequate as well as low quality. Training facilities, both in industry and agriculture, are extremely limited. The overall training of skilled workers is almost inadequate. And the requirements of what has just been called a knowledge economy and digital future, we have hardly made a start. So these are the factors which affect our ability to compete in the global markets and prepare ourselves for the digital age. The fourth factor I'll mention, which has already been hinted at, is the large-scale decay in our institutions. And this is extremely serious. And you have heard that because of our revenue collecting institutions, our tax GDP ratio is very low. Similarly, in many other areas where we have, for example, public sector enterprises after the nationalization of the early 70s are losing 1,300 billion every month. Our institutions, power distribution, as well as many other local institutions cannot provide services to the people without corruption, and so on and so forth. And of course, many of the regulatory institutions also require. So this is a very all-embracing project which affects many large. And finally, our failure to evolve a sustainable and inclusive democratic process or system is the core of our problems. So these are the 5 major lessons or inadequacies or challenges that I want to highlight. Now, moving from here to the recommendations, let me begin with the last one first, because Pakistan was created through a democratic process, but we have now been able to create a sustainable process. And as the invitation letter said, we have to reflect and learn lessons and prepare ourselves for the future in the light of Quaid-e-Azam's vision of hope, courage, and confidence. The first major requirement in this context is a governing system that is within the Constitution and on democratic principles and new political rules of the game that end the current intense polarization. As we all remember, we have lived under military rule for almost half of our independent existence, direct military rule, and indirect military rule for many more years. So when the de facto military rule with a planned civilian facade becomes the norm, then how do we strengthen the democratic process? If we had had elections every 5 years in the last 70 years, we would have had new leadership from the grassroots, stronger political parties. But unfortunately, this has not happened, and we have glided into what is now called a military managed system, kind of hybrid system, in which there is no locus of authority, and the system is not able to deliver. Nobody is suggesting that the army defense forces should be weakened. We need them for defending the borders, as well as to take care of the terrorism and fundamental extremism, etc. And they have done a marvelous job in both these areas. But then, will a strong army allow space to civilian leadership to improve its capacity to govern? Well, if that becomes the norm, a de facto hybrid system, then obviously democracy cannot grow. So what we need is a new charter of democratic governance, which is based on the constitution, but also has new rules of the political game, so that the polarization which has now permeated all segments of our society can be eliminated. And then, of course, if we do this, then our system will improve, because today, on all international indicators, whether it's justice, human rights, gender rights, or many others, Pakistan is very close to the bottom. And of course, technology and business confidence also. So it shows, that the real challenge we have is to improve our governing system. Now, if that is done, then the next recommendation that I would like to arrest is to arrest the institutional decay by protecting them from political pressures and merit-based system. I think one of our basic flaws has been that we have departed very heavily from the merit-based system in recruitment, promotion, and transfers, particularly in the public sector. So if we want our institutions to come back, we have to scrupulously follow the merit system. And similarly, we have to pay then systematic attention to factors that affect productivity. And we just heard one presentation on how the digital future factor has to come in. So otherwise, we will not be able to compete in the rest of the world and prepare ourselves for the digital future. And in all this, I think we have to agree as a nation that our first priority is economic development and growth rate, because we have the potential and we need it to protect our sovereignty and have a prosperous Pakistan, which is the topic of our today. And for this, we have a very remarkable geographical location, which has so far been a liability, but it has become, through CPEC, it can become an asset. And also, for this, we also need affordable energy, as I mentioned earlier, and we need a crash program for dams, and also an effective implementation of the 2018 water policy, national water policy. This was approved unanimously by the 4 provinces and the Prime Minister on 24th April 2018, and it lays down all the requirements of water management, water conservation, as well as water development. And through new institutions, particularly, virtually 4 WAPDAs, because now it's a provincial subject. And the recent floods have shown that the dams constructed by irrigation departments, Balochistan, have all been washed away. So we need to devote our best talent through these provincial water authorities, as well as groundwater management authorities, to be able to manage our water resources better. Closely related to the water policy is our agricultural productivity. To get more crops per drop, we have 80% of our area under irrigation. Very few countries have that, but we are wasting our water, and through drip and through sprinkle, we can conserve this water. At least 1/3 we can increase without additional water by having better agriculture technology. Then finally, of course, we have, for all this, we require human resources which are trained, skilled, and well motivated. And we must fulfill our commitment to spend 4% of GDP on education and 2% on health. And with that, we also have to pay greater attention to the population problem. Otherwise, we'll keep running faster and faster to stay at the same pace. So these are some of the recommendations which I hope future rulers can think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aziz. I don't think many would disagree with the vision you have presented. Lastly, I request the Chair, Professor S.N. Iqbal, Minister for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, to share his vision for a prosperous Pakistan, or as his Twitter handle says, his vision for a better Pakistan. Professor S.N. Iqbal.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। ये तो आई प्रेफर कि मैं उर्दू में बात करूं ताकि बाहर के लोग भी शरीक हो सके। सबसे पहले तो ऑन बिहाफ ऑफ प्लानिंग कमीशन और मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ प्लानिंग एंड डेवलपमेंट मैं आप सबका
शुक्रिया अदा करता हूं कि आप इस इंतहाई अहम 75वीं यौम आज़ादी की तकरीबात के सिलसिले में मुज़ाकरे में शरीक हुए। प्लानिंग कमीशन जो कि पाकिस्तान की तरक्की के साथ बराह रास्त वाबस्ता रहा है, हमने ये महसूस किया कि पाइड के साथ मिलकर मुल्क के जो मायानाज इकोनॉमिस्ट हैं और डेवलपमेंट लीडर्स हैं, उनको दावत दें कि हम अपने 75 साल की तारीख़ का ओवरव्यू सामने रखते हुए मुस्तकबिल के लिए लाए अमल मुरतब कर सकें। इतनी सारी दानिश और इतने अहले इल्म के बाद अमूमन जो चेयर है उसके पास सिर्फ शुक्रिया कहने के अल्फाज बाकी रह जाते हैं। लेकिन चूँकि मैं एक सियासतदान भी हूँ और सियासतदान के सामने सामीन हो और माइक हो और वो सिर्फ शुक्रिया अदा करे तो उसकी रेपुटेशन को ख़तरा हो सकता है। तो इसलिए मैं चंद अल्फाज ज़रूर कहना चाहूँगा, क्योंकि ये एक ऐसा शोबा है जो मेरे दिल से भी बड़ा करीब है। पाकिस्तान की कहानी मैं अपनी ज़िंदगी के साथ उसे जोड़ता हूँ। 1997 में मैं पहली बार जब हुकूमत में आया तो मेरी उम्र 39 साल थी और मैं अमेरिका से ताज़ा पढ़ के आया हुआ था। तो मुझे वज़ीर आज़म नवाज़ शरीफ साहब ने कहा कि आप क्या ज़िम्मेदारी लेना चाहेंगे। तो मैंने कहा मैं रवायती सियासतदान नहीं हूँ, चूँकि एक एजुकेशन के साथ आया हूँ, तो मैं कोई गैर रवायती काम करना चाहूँगा और अपनी तालीम को मुल्क के लिए इस्तेमाल में लाना चाहूँगा। तो मैंने कहा जैसे मलेशिया में डॉक्टर महातीर ने विजन 2020 के साथ मलेशिया की किस्मत बदली है, तो हम पाकिस्तान के लिए क्यों नहीं एक रोड मैप बना सकते और पाकिस्तान को तब्दील कर सकते। उन्होंने कहा बहुत अच्छा ख्याल है, तो आप इस तरह करें, पहले मलेशिया जाके डॉक्टर महातीर की टीम से मिलें और उस सारी चीज़ को देखें और फिर अपना प्लान ज़रूर बनाएं। जब हम मलेशिया गए तो जिससे भी मिलें वो कहे कि हम आपको क्या बतलाएं, हम तो 1960 में आपको देख के तरक्की सीखते थे, तो हमने तो जो कुछ किया वो आपके तजुर्बे की रोशनी में हमने किया, तो अब हम आपको वापस क्या बता सकते हैं। तो शर्मिंदा होकर वापस आ गए। खैर हमने विजन 2010 बनाया और उसमें मुल्क की मुस्तकबिल की प्रोजेक्शन की कि किस तरह 2010 तक हम एक मिडिल इनकम कंट्री बन सकते हैं। और मुझे अच्छी तरह याद है कि उसमें 98 में जब हमने बनाया तो पाकिस्तान में बिजली सरप्लस थी और हम इंडिया को एक्सपोर्ट की बात कर रहे थे। लेकिन उस विजन 2010 में ये शामिल था कि अगर हमने अपनी पावर जनरेशन को ऑगमेंट नहीं किया तो बियॉन्ड 2006 वी विल हैव सीरियस एनर्जी डेफिसिट्स और वो बढ़ते चले जाएंगे। और खैर वो 2 साल बाद मार्शल लॉ लगा तो वो विजन फारिग हो गया और फिर 2006 के बाद एनर्जी डेफिसिट्स भी आना शुरू हो गए। खैर फिर विल्डरनेस में चले गए, फिर 2013 में वापस आए। फिर मुझे प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने कहा कि अब आप कौन सी जिम्मेदारी लेना चाहते हैं। मैंने कहा वो एक अनफिनिश्ड काम है, तो उसी को ठीक करना है और उसी को शुरू करना है। पूरे मुल्क के स्टेक होल्डर्स इकट्ठे किए, PTI کی حکومت پرویز خٹک صاحب چیف منسٹر اسے ساتھ ملایا, پیپلز پارٹی کی حکومت سندھ میں اس کو ساتھ ملایا, نیشنلسٹ کو ساتھ ملایا, 1000 سے زیادہ سٹیک ہولڈر سے کنسلٹیشن کیا, اور ہم نے ویژن 2025 کہ بائی 2025 وی شوڈ بی ان دا ٹاپ 25 اکانومیز. جب ہم نے وہ کیا تو لوگ ہم پہ ہنسے. آپ کو نظر نہیں آتا ہر روز تو خود کچھ بمبار پھٹتا ہے, 16 گھنٹے بجلی نہیں ہے ملک کے اندر, آپ کہتے ہیں ٹاپ 25 میں آ جائیں گے. لیکن الحمدللہ ہم چلے, اللہ تعالیٰ نے مدد کی, سی پیک کو ایک حقیقت بنایا. 29 بلین ڈالرز کی انویسٹمنٹ 4 سالوں میں پاکستان میں آئی, پاکستان کا برانڈ امیج بن گئی. اور 2017 میں یہ حالت تھی کہ میرے پاس یہاں پہ میرے دفتر میں امریکہ کے سفیر آئے, برطانیہ کے ہائی کمشنر آئے, یورپین یونین کے امبیسڈرز, سب کا ایک سوال ہوتا تھا کہ ایکسیلنسی ٹیل اس ہاؤ کین آور کمپنیز جوائن سی پیک پروجیکٹس. سو پوری دنیا جو پاکستان کو ایک سیکورٹی اسٹیٹ دیکھتی تھی, آل آف اے سڈن دا ہول ورلڈ اسٹارٹیڈ سینگ پاکستان ایز این انویسٹمنٹ ڈیسٹینیشن. ہماری پروفائل بدل گئی. اور پرائس واٹر ہاؤس کوپرز نے 2017 میں اسٹڈی جو ریلیز کی فور کاسٹ ورلڈ اکانومیز کی, اس میں انہوں نے کہا کہ if پاکستان کیپس دس ٹریجیکٹری بائی 2030 اٹ ول بی ان دا ٹاپ 20 اکانومیز. تو وی ور ویری ہیپی کہ اٹ از اے ویلیڈیشن آف آر گول. بٹ دین ان 2018 چینج ہیپنڈ, اور اس چینج کے بعد ایوری تھنگ واز ریورسڈ, اور سی پیک بھی ریورس ہو گیا, اور باقی ایک اور ٹینجنٹ پہ ہم چلے گئے. 2018 میں when I left this ministry, the PSDP was 1000 billion rupees. And 4 years later, جب میں نے اپریل 2022 میں دوبارہ یہاں پہ آ کے وزارت کو سنبھالا تو PSDP کا سائز 550 ارب روپے ورثے میں ملا 4 سال کے بعد. اور اگر آپ اسے 2018 کی پرائس پہ لے کر آئیں تو شاید 300 ارب اس کی قیمت بنے گی. 22 کروڑ کی آبادی, 2/3 ینگ ہے, اور اس کے لیے اگر 550 ارب کی ہماری PSDP رہ گئی ہے, آپ دیکھیے کہ اس میں کیا پلان ہوگا اور کیا بنے گا اور کیا ملک کا سلسلہ چلے گا. سو یہ آج 75ویں سالگرہ پہ جب ہم کھڑے ہیں تو مجھے 1997 کا وہ آسن اقبال یاد آ رہا ہے کہ جس نے ویژن 2010 بنایا تھا, اور وہ بڑا پر امید تھا کہ ہم ملک کو فلاں جگہ لے جائیں گے. لیکن آج 75ویں سالگرہ پہ جب میرے بال سفید ہو گئے ہیں تو میں بڑا تاریخ میں اور اپنی اولاد کے سامنے اور اپنی نئی نسل کے سامنے اپنی نسل کی نمائندگی کرتے ہوئے شرمسار ہوں کہ ہم نے 25 سال ضائع کر دیے ہیں. 25 سالوں میں ہم ملک کو کوئی مستقل سمت نہیں دے سکے. اگر 4 قدم آگے گئے ہیں تو پھر 6 قدم پیچھے بھی گئے ہیں, اور شاید یہی المیہ ہے ہماری کہانی کا. پاکستان 47 سے 2022 دیکھنے کی 2 جہتیں ہیں. ایک ہماری اپنی ٹریجیکٹری کیا ہے, وہ بلا شبہ بہت شاندار ہے. پاکستان سٹارٹڈ ناٹ وتھ زیرو سٹارٹ لائن بٹ نیگیٹو سٹارٹ لائن. جیسے کہا گیا کوئی ہمارے پاس انڈسٹری نہیں تھی, کل اثاثہ 2-3 چھوٹی چھوٹی ٹیکسٹائل ملیں تھیں. کراچی شاید اس وقت گوادر سے تھوڑا سا, جو آج کل گوادر کی شکل ہے, اس سے کچھ بہتر ایک پورٹ سٹی چھوٹی سی تھی. اور پاکستان میں نہ کوئی انڈسٹری تھی. انڈیا میں اس وقت ایک اسٹیل مل تھی. تو ہم اس نہ بے سر و سامانی سے اگر آج دیکھیں کہ ہماری جو پروگریشن ہے, یقیناً وہ بہت شاندار ہے کہ ہم نے اپنی آمدنی میں بھی اضافہ کیا, صنعتی ترقی بھی کی. آج ہم گاڑیاں بھی بناتے ہیں, ٹریکٹر بھی بناتے ہیں, جہاز بھی بناتے ہیں, ایک ایٹمی طاقت بھی بن گئے ہیں, یونیورسٹیز بھی کھول لی ہیں, میڈیکل کالجز بھی کھول لی ہیں. تو اس 47 سے آج کا جو سفر ہے بلا شبہ بہت اچھا ہے. لیکن کیا سفر کو ناپنے کا صرف یہی پیمانہ ہے کہ ہم اپنے ساتھ اسے ناپیں؟ جب ہم اس سفر کو دوسروں کے ساتھ ناپتے ہیں تو وہ ایک بہت مایوس کن سفر ہے. جیسے ابھی آپ نے سنا کہ 1960 میں پاکستان کی ایکسپورٹس ساؤتھ کوریا, ملیشیا اور تھائی لینڈ کے برابر تھیں. 200 ملین ہماری تھی, 200 ملین ان کی تھی ڈالرز. آج ساؤتھ کوریا 560 ارب ڈالر سے اوپر ہے, ملیشیا 300 ارب ڈالر سے اوپر ہے, تھائی لینڈ 250 ارب ڈالر سے اوپر ہے, اور ہم 30 بلین ڈالر پہ. 1980 میں پاکستان کی پر کیپٹا انکم $300 تھی. چائنا کی $200 تھی. آج چائنا جو ہے $15,500 پہ اور ہم $1,500 پہ ہیں. سن 2000 میں ٹرکی کی ایکسپورٹس $50 ارب تھیں, ہماری $10 ارب تھیں. آج ہماری ایکسپورٹ 20 سال کے بعد صرف $30 ارب ہے اور ٹرکی کی $288 ارب ہے. تاریخ میں آپ اٹھا لیں, جس ملک نے جاپان, ساؤتھ کوریا, ملیشیا, سنگاپور, ویٹنام, بنگلہ دیش, چائنا, ٹرکی, جس ملک نے ترقی کی ہے اس نے ایکسپورٹ لیڈ گروتھ ماڈل کو اپنایا. ہم نے 1960 میں کسی نے ہمیں امپورٹ سبسٹیٹیوشن کا سبق پڑھا دیا, اس کو سینے سے لگا کے آج تک بیٹھے رہے. نتیجہ یہ ہے کہ ہماری جو ترقی کی داستان ہے وہ رولر کوسٹر ہے. جو ہم ترقی کرنے لگتے ہیں اس سے ڈیمانڈ بڑھتی ہے, اس سے امپورٹ ہوتی ہے, پروپینسٹی ٹو کنزیوم ڈالرز بڑھتی ہے, لیکن آر کیپیسٹی ٹو ارن ڈالرز بڑھتی نہیں ہے. نتیجتاً بیلنس آف پیمنٹ کرائسس ہو جاتا ہے, پھر بریکیں لگا کے گاڑی روکنی پڑتی ہے. سو یہ مسلسل یہ رولر کوسٹر ایسا ہی چلتا آ رہا ہے. اگر اسے ہم نے بریک کرنا ہے کوئی اور راستہ نہیں, سوائے یہ ہے کہ ہم ایک ریپڈ ایکسپورٹ لیڈ گروتھ ماڈل کی طرف جائیں اور ایک لیپ فراگ گروتھ کریں. اس پہ انکریمنٹل گروتھ بھی آپشن نہیں ہے. اب سوال یہ ہے کہ یہ سب چیزیں ہوئیں کیوں نہیں. بہت سے لوگوں نے تشخیصیں کیں, کوئی کہے گا ہم نے یہ نہیں ٹھیک کیا, کوئی کہے گا یہ نہیں ٹھیک کیا. میرے نزدیک پاکستان کی اگر ہم 75 سال کی تشخیص درست نہیں کریں گے تو ہم اگلا علاج بھی ٹھیک نہیں کر سکتے. اور میرے نزدیک جو 2 فنڈامنٹل پرابلمز ہیں جنہوں نے پاکستان کو پوٹینشیل ریئلائز نہیں کرنے دیا, جو سرتاج صاحب نے بھی آخر میں نشاندہی کی, لیک آف پولیٹیکل اسٹیبلٹی اینڈ لیک آف کنٹینیوٹی آف پالیسیز. آپ دنیا کے کسی ملک کے اندر بہترین سارے نوبل لاریٹس لا کے اکٹھے کر دیں, 22 کروڑ افراد جو ہیں وہ نوبل لاریٹس بن جائیں, لیکن اگر اس ملک میں اسٹیبلٹی نہیں ہے اور پالیسیز کی کنٹینیوٹی نہیں ہے تو وہ ملک ایک قدم آگے نہیں چل سکے گا. تو اس لیے ہمیں آج میرا خیال ہے کہ اس 75ویں سالگرہ پہ فیصلہ یہ کرنا ہے کہ بحیثیت قوم will we repeat what we have been doing in 75 years or we'll take a new path. اور وہ نیو پاتھ جو ہے وہ اسی پہ ہے کہ ایک ہم نیو کانٹریکٹ, جیسے سرتاج صاحب نے کہا, چاہے اسے اکانومی کا نام دے لیں, چاہے گورننس کا نام دے لیں, چاہے اس کو ہم کانسٹیٹیوشن کا نام دے لیں, ایک گرینڈ نیشنل کنسنسس کی ضرورت ہے کہ ہم اس ملک میں پولیٹیکل اسٹیبلٹی کو کمپرومائز نہیں ہونے دیں گے اور اس ملک میں کنٹینیوٹی آف پالیسیز کو یقینی بنائیں گے. یہ جب ہوگا تبھی ریفارم ہوگا. عشرت صاحب سے بہتر اور باقی ڈاکٹر ندیم صاحب ہیں, باقی سب اکانومسٹ ہیں, پروجیکٹس جو ہیں آپ 2-3 سال میں کر سکتے ہیں, پروگرامز آپ 3 سے 5 سال میں کر سکتے ہیں. پالیسی جو ہے وہ 10 سال درکار ہوتے ہیں. 10 سال سے پہلے کوئی پالیسی ڈویڈنڈ نہیں دے سکتی, اور اگر اس کو ایک تسلسل نہ ملے, کنٹینیوٹی نہ ملے, تو بہترین پالیسیاں بھی فیل ہو جاتی ہیں. تو اس لیے میں سمجھتا ہوں کہ ہمارے لیے جو سبق ہے فیوچر کا وہ یہی ہے کہ ہم کس طرح پاکستان کو ایک فاسٹ ایکسپورٹ لیڈ گروتھ ماڈل پہ ڈال سکتے ہیں, ہم کس طرح پولیٹیکل اسٹیبلٹی کو یقینی بنا سکتے ہیں. اسی سے جڑی ہوئی جو ہے ہماری پالیسیز کی تسلسل ہے, اور اسی طرح جو ہمارا ایک ناکامی ہے کہ ہم اپنے ہیومن ریسورس کو ڈیولپ نہیں کر سکے. دنیا میں سیاسی عدم استحکام کے علاوہ کوئی ایک قوم نہیں ہے جو جہالت کے ساتھ ترقی کی ہو. سو ایجوکیشن از اے نیسیسری کنڈیشن بٹ مے ناٹ بی سفیشینٹ کنڈیشن, بٹ از اے نیسیسری کنڈیشن کہ جس قوم میں تعلیم نہیں ہے, لٹریسی ہم نہیں کر سکے, ہم ہائر ایجوکیشن نہیں کر سکے, انوویشن ریسرچ نہیں کر سکے, تو اس کے لیے ہیومن ریسورس اگر نہیں ہے تو یہ بھی ہمارا ایک خود فریبی ہے جس کو ہم دعوت دیں گے. تو لہٰذا فیوچر کے لیے میرے خیال میں 7 ڈوز ہیں جو بڑے کرٹیکل ہیں, اور 3 ہمارے ڈو ناٹس ہیں جن کو ہم نے کسی طرح ایڈریس کرنا ہے. فرسٹ جو ڈوز ہیں اس میں ٹیکس ہے کہ کین وی گو بیونڈ 10% آف GDP ٹو 16-18% GDP, which is normal for those countries which show good performance. جتنے اچھے ملک ہیں وہ 16-18-20% ٹیکس ٹو GDP پہ ہیں, تو ہم کس طریقے سے ٹیکس ریفارمز کے ذریعے اپنے ٹیکس کی صلاحیت بڑھائیں. نمبر 2, انویسٹمنٹ کلائمیٹ. پبلک سیکٹر انویسٹمنٹ کے دن ختم ہو گئے, اب حکومت کے خزانے خالی ہیں. پرائیویٹ سیکٹر اور فارن ڈائریکٹ انویسٹمنٹ از آر آپشن. تو حکومت کا کام یہ ہے کہ انیبلنگ انوائرمنٹ کریٹ کرے, زنجیریں ختم کرے, ریڈ ٹیپ ختم کرے, ریگولیشن ختم کرے, NOC پرمٹ ختم کرے, اور پرائیویٹ سیکٹر کو زیادہ سے زیادہ انیبل کرے. دیٹ از دا اونلی وے دیٹ وی کین اٹریکٹ انویسٹمنٹ. ادروائز جیسے میں نے آپ سے کہا کہ آج اس سال 700 ارب کا PSD ہے, اس سے آپ کیا کر سکتے ہیں؟ کچھ بھی نہیں کر سکتے. تو ہاؤ ڈو وی کریٹ این انوائرمنٹ جس میں FDI لا سکتے ہیں اور اپنے انویسٹمنٹ کو کر سکتے ہیں. اب FDI کی کہانی دیکھ لیں. ویتنام 10 کروڑ کا ملک ہے, ہم سے آدھا ہے, سال کی 28 ارب روپے, $28 بلین FDI. میانمار ایک چھوٹا سا ملک ہے, سال کی $2 ارب کی, $4 ارب کی FDI, اور ہم $1.8 بلین FDI, 22 کروڑ کا ملک ہے. تو دنیا میں $900 بلین ڈیولپنگ کنٹریز میں FDI سرکولیٹ کر رہی ہے دنیا میں کہ کہیں مجھے لینڈ کرا لو. تو اف وی آر ناٹ ایبل ٹو اٹریکٹ تو ہم لوزر ہوں گے. لہٰذا ہمارا فرض ہے کہ ہم اس میں سے زیادہ سے زیادہ بڑا حصہ لیں. اسی طرح تھرڈ از ایکسپورٹس, کہ انلیس وی گو فرام 30 ٹو مے بی, یہ تو بات ہوئی یہاں پہ ابھی 40 یا 50 بلین کی. آئی وڈ سے the catch is کہ how fast we cross the $100 billion mark. The moment $100 billion mark ہم cross کر لیں گے, the next 100 will come very easy. So اب catch یہ ہے کہ $100 billion ہم 10 سال میں کریں گے یا 4 سال میں کریں گے. That will determine the pace of our development. So I think we have to be, the whole system has to be now focused on export and export. چاہے وہ agriculture ہے, چاہے وہ industry ہے, چاہے وہ service sector ہے. That is what we are also not trying in the short time جو ہمارے پاس ہے اس پہ ہم چلیں. Then I would say کہ another important challenge is embracing technology and reforming our governance system, کہ جو catalyst بنے transformation کا. We don't need governance for status quo. ہمارے پورے governance structures کی جو training ہے وہ ہے کہ how to manage status quo. It has to become transformational governance. اور اس کے لیے ایک پورا جو DNA ہے ہماری گورننس کا وہ چینج کرنے کی ضرورت ہے, اور اس کی ری اورینٹ کرنے کی بھی ضرورت ہے, ری انجینئر کرنے کی بھی ضرورت ہے. جو چند ایک ڈو ناٹ جو ہمارے چیلنجز ہیں جس کو ہم کیسے ڈیل کریں گے, اس پہ یہ سارے اچھے کاموں کا انحصار ہے. اس میں ایک بات سرتاج صاحب نے بھی کہی, سرکولر ڈیٹ انرجی کا. وہ ایک اتنا بڑا ڈرین ہے کہ اس کو ہم کیسے ڈیل کریں گے. نمبر 2, آر ڈیٹ. اس سال حکومت پاکستان 3000 ارب وفاقی حکومت ٹیکسوں سے اکٹھا کرے گی, 4000 ارب صوبوں کو دے کے اس کے پاس 3000 بچے گا. جو ڈیٹ لائبلٹی ہے وہ 4000 ارب کی ہے. آپ اگر اس 3 میں 2000 ارب نان ٹیکس ریونیو ڈال لیں تو آپ کا قرضہ اتار کے آپ کے پاس پیچھے 1000 ارب بچتا ہے. اب 1500 ارب ڈیفینس ہے, تو ڈیفینس میں 500 ارب روپے کا ادھار ڈل گیا. اس کے بعد 550 ارب روپیہ حکومت چلانے کا خرچہ سارا ادھار. اس کے بعد 530 ارب روپیہ پینشن ہے وہ ساری ادھار. 700 ارب روپیہ ڈیولپمنٹ ہے وہ سارا ادھار. تقریباً 1100 ارب ٹرانسفرز ہیں صوبوں کو یا اسٹیٹ انٹرپرائزز کو, وہ سارا ادھار. تقریباً 700 یا 900 ارب کی سبسڈیز ہیں وہ سارا ادھار. اس بیلنس شیٹ کے ساتھ کوئی کمپنی تو نہیں چل سکتی, ملک کیسے چل سکتا ہے. تو لہٰذا ہمیں یہ جو ڈریگز ہیں ہمارے اوپر, چاہے وہ سرکولر ڈیٹ ہے, چاہے ڈیٹ سروسنگ کی کاسٹ ہے, اس کو ایڈریس کرنا پڑے گا. پھر تیسرا, اسٹیٹ اونڈ انٹرپرائزز. تقریباً $2.5 ارب کی سالانہ اس کی ہمارے اوپر لاگت ہے, چاہے وہ PIA ہے, چاہے وہ ریلوے ہے, چاہے وہ اسٹیل مل ہے, چاہے یہ سارے ادارے ہیں. ان کو کتنی جلدی سے ہم یا تو پرائیویٹائز کریں, ان سے ان کی جان چھڑائیں, یا اگر ان کو ٹرن اراؤنڈ کر سکتے ہیں جو کہ بڑا ناممکن ہے, آج تک تو ہوا نہیں ہم سے, لیکن ان کا حل کیا ہوگا؟ اگر یہ ہول رہیں گے تو آپ جتنا کچھ کمائیں گے اس کے اندر بلیک ہول میں جاتا رہے گا. تو میں سمجھتا ہوں کہ یہ وہ چند ایک چیزیں ہیں کہ جس کے اوپر اب ہم سب کو ایک بڑے یکسوئی کے ساتھ کام کرنے کی ضرورت ہے, اور ضرورت اس بات کی ہے کہ ایک ٹیم پاکستان ہم کریٹ کریں, ہم اختلاف کریں لیکن نفرت نہ کریں, اور ہماری کمپیٹ کرنے کی صلاحیت, ہمارے کولیبریٹ کرنے کی صلاحیت کو نہ کھا جائے. ایک اچھا نظام وہی ہوتا ہے کہ جس کے اندر پلیئرز سائملٹینیسلی کمپیٹ بھی کرتے ہیں اور کولیبریٹ بھی کرتے ہیں. لیکن اگر کسی نظام میں صرف وہ کمپیٹ کریں اور کولیبریٹ کرنے کی صلاحیت کھو دیں تو وہ نظام پھر سیلف ڈسٹرکٹیو نظام بن جاتا ہے. تو یہی ایک میں سمجھتا ہوں کہ ضروری ہے کہ پاکستان کے جو پوٹینشیلز ہیں, جو ہماری تاریخ کے اسباق ہیں, اس میں جو سب سے بڑا سبق میرے نزدیک تو یہی ہے کہ کیا ہم مستقبل میں سیاسی استحکام پیدا کر سکیں گے, کیا ہم مستقبل کے لیے پالیسیز کے اندر تسلسل لے کر آ سکیں گے. اگر یہ دو کام ہم نے کر لیے تو ہماری فیکٹر انڈاؤمنٹس اتنی اچھی ہیں کہ ہمیں کسی کی کوئی اور مدد کی ضرورت نہیں ہے, وہ ایک خود بخود انجن چل جائے گا. میری دعا ہے کہ اللہ تعالیٰ ہم سب کی رہنمائی کرے کہ ہم ان چیزوں کو حاصل کر سکیں. میں ایک دفعہ پھر اپنے جو تمام لرنڈ ہمارے مقررین ہیں ان کا دل کی گہرائیوں سے شکریہ ادا کرتا ہوں. یقیناً پاکستان زندہ باد.
If you just have 2 minutes, before we close the proceedings, I would request you to present commemorative tokens to the speakers. Very quick, 2 minutes just. Mr. Zohair Khaliq. Mr. Zohair Khaliq. Dr. Nadeem Al-Haq. He was a speaker. Secretary Zafar Ali Shah. Daud Saab. Unko jo, I mean, the speakers who are not here would be sent their tokens. Then inko bilkul milenge. And in the end, I would request Dr. Nadeem Al-Haq to give the token to Professor S.N. Iqbal. Thank you everyone for joining us. Khuda Hafiz and Pakistan Zindabad.